Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to another Adobe XD Masterclass. My name is Howard Pinsky, Senior XD Evangelist here at Adobe. Hope you're all doing well on this Friday afternoon. We've made it through another week, and as Renee is pointing out in the chat, it's almost Valentine's Day, which in our household is simply just the day before my birthday. So we kind of do everything at once. But if you are tuning in live here on Behance, I'd love to know who you are and where you're tuning in from. Let me know in the chat. We've got Umacorn and Renee and Arshad, Laura, Wade, Rose, and Katerina. Great. Robert, great to see all of you. Hope you're well. Hope you're all excited for the weekend. And of course, another Adobe XD Masterclass. Masterclass number, I almost said 73. 83. We are 17 away from 100, which is super exciting. Hey Jack, great to see you, and Lucas and Chris and Rebecca, awesome. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and hop over to my screen. And if you've been following the last few weeks of masterclasses, we've been building out a UI kit for a finance application, and we've made some decent progress. Of course, there's a lot more to do, but we're not going to be spending too much time on this UI kit. Definitely don't want to drag it on for too much longer. So this will probably be the last week we focus on this specific kit. Next week, we'll cover something else. If anyone has suggestions, definitely let me know on Twitter. But I'll be working on this kit on the side, and then hopefully it'll be released in February or March. So definitely stay tuned for that. And as a bit of a preview, if you follow me on Instagram, here are a few screens that will be part of this kit. There will be dark mode, there will be light mode, there'll be a lot of different screens. I've already started to design some of the more in-depth and overlays and things like that. Contacts, payment screens, transactions, we might be covering some of this today. Now, one of the things we did not cover today, or last week I should say, is the navigation bar. So we've covered the sign-in screen. We have our two-factor authentication screen over here. And then we started the process of building out our home screen. But we don't currently have a navigation bar to navigate to the various screens that are going to be part of this experience. And I'll remind some of you, hey, Benjamin, great to see you, and Drew. If anyone has questions throughout this stream, definitely let me know in the chat. I will be taking a quick peek from time to time. All right, so I think that's where we're going to start today. We're going to start building out the navigation bar. We're going to be really focusing on using components, nested components, all sorts of fun stuff. And then once we do have multiple screens that utilize this navigation bar, we will be able to wire them up really nicely. All right, so at the bottom of this particular screen, and we can design this on this screen, another screen, or on the artboard if we, or the pasteboard if we wanted to. Cornell's saying, I can see your cute glows on my face. Yes, so I have, I'm getting fancy with my new studio. If you haven't seen my new studio yet, here's a sneak peek of it. I haven't shown the whole thing yet, but I have these lights in the background. I also have a bunch of other lights on the side. So I decided to, put some nice glows. I've a pink one over here, blue one over here. No purpose, just, I like colors and lights. All right. So what we're going to be doing is building out this navigation bar. So we're going to start with the good old rectangle tool, and I'm going to draw out something like this. Now, of course, the size of your navigation bar will really come down to what's on it, how many icons there are, how large the icons will be, all sorts of different things. And you'll also have to remember that right about down here, let me make this a bit thicker, right about here-ish, on an iPhone at least, you have the home indicator. So you can swipe up to go to the home screen. So definitely keep that in mind. You don't want to put any icons in this area. Won't be able to interact with it. Saddam is saying, how late am I? You are not very late. I basically said hello and we just jumped into XD. So you are just on time. All right. So we have our container that we're going to be using for this particular navigation bar. Now, of course, we want to start styling this a little bit. Now, you know, I love rounded corners, especially in this particular application. We have a lot of rounded corners going on. So to keep consistency, we're going to round out these corners a little bit. I probably don't want to go too much. Somewhere around 24 might be too much. I would probably argue, I keep hitting my microphone. I would argue maybe 8. 8 might be a bit too little. Let's try 16. Hey, Megan, great to see you. And Cornell, I'm glowing. Fancy. So I have our rounded corners set to 16, but for this particular navigation bar, we may not want the corners at the bottom left and bottom right to be rounded as well. Now, if we were to do something like this, right, something like this, then it would totally make sense. But because we're extending this navigation bar from edge to edge, the bottom corners I'm going to pull back. So I'm going to hold down my Alt or Option key and view, and then on the other side as well. And you can also do that within your properties inspector over to the right. You can enter the same value for all the corner radiuses, 16, 16, 16, 16, right? Or you can reduce them to whatever you might need. In this case, 0 and 0 for the bottom left and right. Perfect. All right, the shape is looking much better. But of course, Chris is saying we need a boop plugin for XD. Who wants to make a boop plugin? That'd be amazing. So we have our container looking pretty good, but of course we want to style it a little bit. Now, because we're going for a darker theme for this particular screen, we're going to go for a darker navigation bar. Now we have to be careful because we don't want it to blend in too much with everything behind it, unless that's your purpose, right? But we want it to stand out a little bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with a fill color. Now, of course, we can do a linear gradient to have it a little bit lighter at the top and a little bit darker at the bottom. We can go for a solid color. Jack says, what would the boop plugin do? It's a good question. Maybe it'll just boop every time you press the repeat grid button. I don't know if that's possible with the current API. It's probably not, but that would be wonderful. All right, so we can go for a linear gradient. Maybe at the top of this navigation bar, it might be a little bit lighter. And then at the bottom, it might be a bit darker. Now, I talk about this a lot, especially with gradients. You want to make sure that the gradients aren't too drastic, right? So something like this, because we're going light to dark, you don't want to do this. It's going to be very distracting. It's going to be difficult to put content on top of it. So you want to keep it very subtle, right? Slightly light at the top and slightly darker at the bottom. Now, the next thing we might want is to help separate it from the content behind it. We may want some sort of a border or an inner shadow. Now, because we are going edge to edge with this particular container, we may not necessarily need a border around all the edges, right? So we can add an inner shadow, but instead of an inner shadow, we actually want an inner highlight. So I'm going to change the color to white, and I'm going to drop the blur amount to 0, and then bump it up. Maybe we'll try 1 on the y-axis, and just to add a little bit of color, I'm going to pop a touch of blue in there, something like that. And like I always mention, when you're designing zoomed in, just hit the play button at the top or Command and Control and return just to see how things are looking. You can also take this entire preview window, move it to another monitor, move it to the side, just so you have nice, a zoomed in view and a zoomed out view looking good at the same time. And I'm actually thinking I might bump up these corners just a little bit more. I still think 24, you know what? Maybe 24 is not too bad. I think let's try 24. We can always change it, especially considering we're going to be using components at some point. All right, looking pretty good. Now, what I'm thinking for this navigation bar is we may have 4 icons that link to different screens, things like home, contacts, transactions, notifications, and then there may be one in the center, more of like a primary action or a floating action button that will do something else. Maybe it'll bring up your cards, or it'll allow you to add or perform some quick actions, which I think will be kind of cool, right? Oh, you guys are talking about the Discord. Yeah, if you have questions about whatever, or you just want to connect with the community, there's a great Discord for Adobe XD. Definitely join that after the masterclass. So for that button in the middle, what I'm thinking is to look something like this, right? We'll have a button right about here. It'll probably be one of our primary colors, something like a purple. We might add a bit of a gradient to it just so it stands out. We'll add a bit of a shadow. And speaking of shadow, you can also add a bit of a shadow behind this navigation bar. We may get to that a little bit later on. But for this, we've got this nice floating action button in the center. We may want it to literally float in the middle of this navigation bar. So what we can do is I'm going to make this a little bit smaller. It might be a little bit too large. Somewhere right about here, maybe 58. And then we want a little bit of a cutout right here on this navigation bar. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this existing shape, Command and Control D. I'm going to enlarge it. Let me change the color so we can see what we're working with. Right, so I'm going to enlarge it like this, something around there. And then we want to use this newly duplicated shape to cut a hole into the navigation bar behind it. So with this shape selected, I'm also going to select the navigation bar. So I'm going to hold down my Shift key and click. So I have both of these shapes selected. And then at the top right-hand corner, we'll want to use our boolean options to subtract, which is going to take that top shape and use it to knock the hole into the navigation bar, just like that. And it also keeps our lovely inner shadow. Of course, if you're not a fan of this particular look, you can switch it over to a border, all sorts of fun stuff, right? I'm gonna name this nav. And the nice thing about using Boolean options or Boolean objects is that they're non-destructive. So I can dive in here and make changes. I can make this shape, the knockout a little bit larger, smaller, whatever I might want. Now, if we take a look at the preview, you're gonna notice that the corners, the edges are very sharp, right? You may be okay with that. But again, because we're going for more of a curvy feel to this entire experience, we may want to add a bit of a curve right on these corners here, right? The left and the right. So here's what we're gonna do. And again, makes it very simple because we're using a Boolean object and it's all non-destructive. So I currently have the circle, the ellipse selected that we use to cut the hole out. I want to access the path. So if I press return or enter, it's going to convert it to a path and give me access to those points. I am going to select the one on the left, and I'm going to bump it out about 20 pixels. So I held down my Shift key and pressed the left arrow twice. I'm going to do the exact same thing, boop and boop, to the one on the right. Now, it just looks kind of wonky right now, right? Now it's even worse. It's just this big, weird blob at the bottom that just doesn't look anything exciting. What we're going to want to do is use these handles to actually create that curve. So if I start pulling on these handles and move this inwards, right, now you can start to see what's going on. And if I hold down my Shift key, I can constrain it along this horizontal line, and I'll leave it right about there. I'll do the exact same thing on the left-hand side. So now we're starting to get somewhere. Can we have the background music lower? Yes, you can. Give me 1 second. We'll see if that helps at all. Let me know, Martin, if that makes it a little bit more enjoyable. Sorry about that. All right, so we have something that looks a little bit better. Again, take a look at the preview. It's got some nice curves to it, but the curve at the bottom is a little bit too much. It's kind of squishing in a little bit, and it doesn't really hug that button that we created a little bit earlier. So what we're gonna have to do in this case is now select this point at the very bottom and holding down Shift to constrain it one more time, bring that on out. And that looks a little bit better, right? Now, of course, I can sit here and tweak this for days and weeks and months, right? Until we get the exact perfect curve, but I think this looks pretty good. I can also move this up a little bit if I needed to. There we go. That looks pretty good. Beautiful. All right, pretty happy with that. Alrighty, so volume sounds pretty good. Wonderful. All right, so we have our navigation bar in place, and I'm pretty happy with the way things are looking. I might want to tweak the colors just a little bit to make this a bit darker. One more thing we could potentially do if we want to get really fancy, because we do have some, if you take a look at the content behind, we've got some interesting colors. We have some greens and pinks and blues, and on some of the other screens, there might be even more of these neon colors. We may want to bring some of that into this navigation bar. Now we could go ahead and just lower the opacity a little bit. It looks fine, right? Or, because this is Fancy Friday, we can add a background blur. So right at the bottom of the Properties Inspector, boop, turn the background blur on. Now, by default, we have a blur of about 30, brightness at 15. We want to keep it dark, right? So we're going to take the brightness or the blur, probably crank it all the way up to about 50, and then drop the brightness to about 0. Now, off, on, whoops, off, nope, wrong one. There we go. On, off, on, off. Very subtle, and you may not notice much of a difference. But once we start enabling scrolling, you're going to start to see some of those colors kind of bleed through. And let me show you how that would look. If I go ahead and select my artboard, and then drag the handle at the bottom downwards, I'm going to leave a little bit of room at the bottom for the navigation bar. We're going to run into a problem, doing this on purpose. I'm going to press play, and we're going to scroll. Now, of course, the navigation bar is floating, which is certainly not what we want. We want that navigation bar to remain fixed to the bottom of this artboard. So I'm going to make sure to select both of these objects. I am going to group them. I'm going to call this navigation. At some point in the near future, we will convert this into a component. But now that this is grouped, we're going to turn on fixed position when scrolling within the Properties Inspector. So this will keep the navigation bar exactly where it is right now. So if we scroll one more time, now we can see what's going on, right? But you can also see, let me zoom in here, that some of those colors are now seeping through, right? Which is kind of nice. It adds a little bit of a fun effect to it. And I can dive in here and make some, I can make it darker and make it lighter a little bit, or I can bring back some of the original fill color. So if I really like the gradient, the light to dark gradient that I added a little bit earlier, I can bring that back by increasing the effect opacity value right down here at the bottom. This will also dampen the blur effect as well. So if you don't want a very drastic blur effect, you can do this, and it'll just be a little bit more subtle, which is kind of nice, right? You don't want these effects that are way too strong and distracting. So I think it looks pretty good. Whoops, I just closed the entire document. Hold on. Give me 1 second. Where did it go? I'm going to switch back to my face just for a moment, just in case any confidential data pops up. Because you never know. Sometimes I'm working on confidential things and definitely don't want that popping up. All right, we're good to go. Don't close the entire document, folks. All right, so we have our navigation bar. And at this point, I think it's a pretty good time to start adding some icons. Like I mentioned earlier, home, contacts, transactions, alerts. And what we're going to be doing with these icons is each of them is going to have 2 states. Maybe 3, but definitely 2. It's going to have an active and a non-active. So when you're at home, it might be solid. When you are at a different screen, it might be outlined, right? So I'm going to make sure to dive in here, and I'm going to hop over to Nucleo, which many of you have seen me use in the past. It's a third-party icon manager, but of course, if you don't have any icons at your disposal, Icons for Design, probably your best bet. Thousands and thousands of open source icons. Cornell says, autosave for the win. You know, we don't really, I think we take this for granted, how amazing autosave is in all these different applications. Years ago, I would have just lost everything, right? But I just closed the document by mistake. I opened it up again. Everything was there. It was amazing. All right, so let's search home. And we're going to start with the inactive icon. So I'm going to maybe select this one right here. I'm going to copy it, paste it. Let's change the color to white. And in terms of the size, this might be a little bit too small. I'm just taking a look at the preview on my other monitor. Definitely looking a little bit too small. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to bump this up. I'm going to turn off responsive resize. Wouldn't matter in this case because it is a fill-based icon. I'm going to lock the aspect ratio, and let's try about 24. It might be still a little bit too small. What do you all think? I think it might be too small. Let's bump it up a little bit more. Let's try about 28. That could be a little bit better. Now, the other thing we might want to do for all of these icons, and this is mostly optional, but I would recommend it if you can, is to put labels below them. So something like home, right? We'll keep it nice and simple. And we may drop the size to about 10, something like that. Semi-bold looks pretty good. I'm going to make sure to center it. And then for the inactive states, we'll actually drop the opacity of both of these icons just a little bit. We don't want to go too much because we will be, on the active states, the icon is going to be solid. So it's going to be very apparent which screen you are on. So you don't have to worry too much about the color difference. But just dropping it a little bit will create that more of an inactive feel, which looks kind of nice. All right, so we have our home icon. Now, one more thing you might want to do, because if you take a look at this, as I'm moving my cursor over top of the icon, and then I move it inside the icon, I can no longer select it. And that's because this icon, even though it's not border-based in the sense that it's made with a border, it's border-based in the sense that it's made with very thin lines. So it could be very difficult to select. It could be difficult to interact with once you have wired this up. So what you might want to do is just grab a rectangle, draw one out, place it behind your icon, and then just drop the opacity to 0. That way, it's a lot easier to select because there's a solid rectangle behind this border-based icon, which is nice. All right, I'm going to move the label inside, and I think that looks okay. Actually, I'm going to bump this up, and the overall group should be 60. That looks pretty good. All right. Now, the next one we're going to be adding will be, let's say, contacts. Let me move this over here. I'm going to close that. So for contact, actually, you know what? Let's stick with home. Let's actually work on both states. So we have our inactive state looking pretty good. I'm pretty happy with the way things are looking. I'm going to create a component over within the Properties Inspector to the right. You can do that in your document assets or the Command or Control K shortcut. So we have our main component here, and this is where you want to make any of your edits to this particular component. And we've already done the work to create our inactive state. So I'm going to press the plus button one more time and create a new state. And this is going to be called active. So with that done, I'm going to hop into Nucleo. I'm going to grab the next icon, paste it in, make sure it's the same size, which I believe was about 28. And for this one, because it's going to be the active screen, we're going to change the color to pure white, and I can ungroup. Let me actually go back over here. I'm going to ungroup this group. It might not be necessary. And then over here, bump that up to 100%. We don't need this one. And there we go. We've got our home icon. Now, on the active or the inactive, we have this little tiny, I guess it's a door, possibly. On this one, there is no door. So, it's really up to you whether you want to leave that door in or recreate it or whatever it might be. I think it looks okay. Oops. I think it looks okay without it. But of course, we can very easily dive in there and create a door if we wanted to. But the point is, we have our default state and we have our active state. And we're going to do the exact same thing for all of these icons. So I'm going to leave that one there. And the next one is going to be contacts. So if I search for something like user, so that would be the active. And then we have our inactive, which is this one. Now this one is an actual border-based icon right down here, right? So I want to make sure to turn off responsive resize. And we're going to set the height to 28, I believe was what the other one is. Now, when you resize a border-based icon or any sort of element, it's going to maintain the border width. So in this case, it was 1.5, which looks a lot thinner than our house over here to the left, right? So I'm going to bump this up to probably about 2, and that looks a bit more accurate. This will be contacts. Now, just to help myself, I'm actually going to drag out a guide. Where did my navigation book go? There it is. Another thing to keep in mind is even though we have the height exactly the same on both of these icons, 28 and 28, because this particular icon is, the border is set to the center, right? So it's kind of on the inside and the outside. It looks a little bit larger than the other icon. Now, because I have the width or the weight of this border the way I want it, what I might want to do is just outline this stroke. So if I go up to the object menu, down to path, and then outline stroke, it's going to convert this, whoops. Oh, that's right. This one is a funky looking icon. So this one I may not want to do that to. Yeah, this one's a funky looking icon. So if I do outline the stroke, it's going to do whatever that is. Saddam is asking, am I available for a project? I am not, unfortunately. I do get a lot of requests for design work here and there, but I wish I had the time, but I just unfortunately do not. All right, so I'm going to drag out one more guide. And I'm just going to make this a little bit smaller so it lines up. There we go. And that should look pretty good. All right, so again, this is our inactive state. So I'm going to drop these to 60%. Create a component, new state, active. Whoop, he lost his head. Turn off responsive resize. %, and perfect. All right, default state and active state. Looking pretty good. So that one is going to be popped right about there. And then we're going to do our transaction state. Let's see if we have a list, or you know what, I'm going to, I think it was, I forget which icon it was that I was using. Let's see if I can find one. It may be in a different library, actually. Let's see. I might steal it from my other document over here. Why not, right? I think it was this one. Or maybe I made this one myself. That might have been it. There we go. Little Martha Stewart action over here. Nobody saw that, right? All right, so this is going to be transactions. There we go. And then, of course, we want our, so this is the active state. So I'm going to keep this to the side. And then the active state, or the inactive state, is basically going to be just these lines. So what I'm going to do, or we could do an outline. So if I go ahead and select just this, I'm going to add a border. Maybe about 2, might be a bit too thick. It's on the inside, I think. Oh, you know what it is? I have a group and a group, and there's a path and all these fun stuff. That's a bit better. There we go. And then these ones, we can leave these as solid because they're essentially borders anyway. And there we go. It's not the greatest looking icon in the world, but it will do. I might move these down a touch. And then, like the other ones, I'm going to drop this to 60. We are going to convert this into a component, create our new state, which is active, and then I'm just going to grab this guy and pop it in here. Perfect. All right, so again, default state, active state. I might change the border at some point of this default state. It doesn't completely match the shape of the one in the background, but for now, that will do. And then the final icon we're going to create in this section is I'm going to maybe something like a bell or notifications, something like this. So we have an inactive, which looks like this. And this one's a fill icon, so it'll make it much easier. Now, here's a fun challenge. Could be UI challenge, could be a UX challenge, could be all sorts of different things, right? Typically, this type of icon is called notifications. Of course, there are many ways, many things you can call it, alerts, notifications, whatever. But if I were to do that, it's very squishy. Because of the way this navigation bar is structured, we have this floating action button in the middle, and then we have these very squishy icons over to the right. So this may be one of those situations where you may want to get rid of the labels or just rethink what they're called, right? And that's kind of why I decided to just call it alerts instead of notifications, just because it was just getting a little bit too squishy, and especially with these icons over here, which don't have that squishiness to them, it was looking a little bit unbalanced. Now, of course, you could take maybe the notifications icon and put it on the left, so you have one that's a bit longer, one that's a bit shorter. You can mix and match and see what that looks like, but I'm going to leave it as this for now. And I'm going to alerts. I'm going to convert this into a component one more time. And finally, grab our solid icon. I'm going to create a new state. Paste it. View. Beautiful. Boop. And boop. And there we go. So now this one is going to, I'm going to pop it on the right-hand side on that guide. Home is basically there. Contacts right about here. It does make it a little bit more difficult, with this floating action and this curve to perfectly line up these icons, but sometimes eyeballing it is your best bet. All right. So someone's asking about the outline stroke effect because it gets distorted when I add. Yeah, so as you may have seen a little bit earlier, when I had that specific border, it did just, actually it was this one over here. Typically outline stroke works fine, or outline path. But if I go down to, or outline stroke, I was right the first time. But if I go down to here, because of the way this one is structured, it distorts it a little bit. I don't have an answer as to why exactly that happens. I can try asking the team, but yeah, for some reason, this particular border distorts a little bit. Wish I had an answer. I don't, unfortunately. Cornell's asking, do you have any ideas for projects for upcoming Masterclass? If not, maybe a stock app could be one. So there will be sort of like a stock experience inside of this, this experience, but I haven't gotten around to that yet. I'm not sure if I'm going to cover that in a Masterclass in the near future, because I do want to mix it up a little bit. We do a lot of financial stuff. So next week might be maybe web-based, but I'm not completely sure just yet, but I'll figure that out fast. All right, so we have our icons, and each of them have an active and an inactive state. And I also want one more. Pinsky for president again. Oh no, don't do that. I want one more icon for the center. Let's see if we have any. These ones are kind of fun. This one, ooh, let's go for this one. For this floating action button, we're going to keep this at a solid icon. There we go. And I might want to give this a little bit of a linear gradient just to make this stand out, because this is a primary button. So we'll add a little bit of a gradient here. Something like that. Nothing too, maybe I'll do a little bit of, maybe I'll swap it. Maybe we'll do blue at the top. And then a bit purple at the bottom. There we go. And then possibly even a little bit of a drop shadow just to kind of pop it out from this navigation bar. So I'm going to drop this to about 8 maybe. I'll maybe blur it a bit. Something like that. Nothing too crazy. Very subtle. That'll do. All right, so we have our navigation bar looking pretty good. But of course, at this point, we want to convert this entire thing into one component. So we can very easily use it on different screens and update it as we need to. So I'm going to make sure to select all of these. I'm also going to group the floating action button. And I have the entire navigation bar group selected. I'm going to create a component over to the right inside of the Properties Inspector. Again, you can use the Command or Control K shortcut. Now, one thing I'll point out is we've been creating and editing our main components for all of these icons, right? But if I dive in here, you're going to notice we now have an instance. Whenever you create a larger component that contains smaller components or nested components inside of them, it automatically converts those into instances. Just makes it a little bit easier to edit globally. So just definitely keep that in mind. All right, it's looking pretty good. And now what we can do is go through and make individual states for the different active screens if we wanted to. We don't necessarily need to, because on every screen we can just dive in here and switch us over to active or default or whatever it might be, right? So we'll keep it at that for now. Now, but there is one more thing we might want to do for this navigation bar, depending on, what this floating action button, what its purpose is, right? Let's assume for a moment that when a user taps on this button, a few different options might pop up. Maybe an option to send money, receive money. Even though we have some quick actions here, on different screens we may not have those, or these may not be. We may decide to get rid of these on the home screen. So we may want to put quick actions kind of in this area here. Now, of course, the icon itself doesn't make much sense at the moment, but let's run with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dive in here and I'm going to set this up. So I might have one icon over here. Chris says maybe nudge the credit card icon down. Yeah, maybe. Is it? Oh, you're right. It might be slightly off. Boop. Could be it. All right, so we might have one over here, and then maybe one in the center, and then maybe and then maybe another one over here. So when you tap on this icon, a few options will kind of fly out, and you'll have, quick actions for something. In this case, we might have the same actions here: send, receive, maybe trade as well, right? So I'm going to just copy these arrows. And let's rotate this, boop and boop. And then I'm going to grab the icon for trade as well, which looks like I made a component last week, which is great. Although when I resize, it's not too bad. I think that'll do. All right, so I'm going to make sure to group these. This will be called send. And I'm sure some of you are already noticing an issue that we're going to run into. Now, the issue that we're going to run into is if we were to activate this floating action button and these, additional actions kind of fly out, it's going to be a little bit hard to see. And also, we may also want to include some text to really let users know what this icon is, what this one is, because, some people may not know what these arrows are. So, if I were to dive in here, right in here, and do something like send. Now, we could add it inside here, or we can place it right below. But you're definitely seeing the issue, right? It's going to be very difficult to read anything. So what we're going to do is we're going to be adding an overlay behind it in just a moment. This will be receive, and this one will be trade. Perfect. I'm going to move this up. Move these up as well. I might even space these out. All right. So we have our actions looking okay, right? But again, very difficult to see. So what we're going to do is we're going to, across this entire artboard, create a rectangle. We're going to set the color to black and then just drop the opacity maybe to about 90% and make sure that this overlay is behind all of our quick action buttons. There we go. So that's essentially what we want it to look like, right? And the fab icon is going to be moved maybe in the back, just like that. We want to be able to see that navigation bar at all times. Now, the big question is, how do we activate this? Because we already have a component for the navigation bar, but this fab menu is not at the moment, right? So what we're going to do is now, if we are going with this particular idea, the quick actions, this credit card icon probably doesn't make much sense. We probably want to use maybe a plus button or something to that effect, right? So let me actually dive in. Actually, I probably don't even need to dive in anywhere. I'm going to just change this icon. Let's make a little circle. And maybe we'll do a border. Oops. Something like that. And then we'll create our plus button with 2 simple lines. It might be a bit too thin, but we'll take a look. Duplicate, rotate 90 degrees. And do we even need that border? We may not. I think a larger plus button that is a little bit thicker could do the trick. All right, so we have our button looking pretty good. So what we want to do is, for this entire fab group, we want to turn this into a component. Now, like I said earlier, when you have a nested component, as I'm about to do, boop, it's going to automatically convert it into an instance, as you can see right up here in the Properties Inspector, or by looking at the diamond at the top left-hand corner. A hollow diamond indicates that is an instance, so it's not the main component. You want to make sure to edit that main component. So if I click on the edit main component icon right here, it's going to take me to this section, right? This component over here. Now, sometimes, depending on the project, you might just want to pop it on the main screen like this. And what we want to do now is create both states. So our active state, which is the collapse state, and our inactive state. So we've already gone ahead and designed out our expanded state. So we might as well keep that as our default, right? Now in this case, instead of a plus button, I'm going to rotate this a little bit. You know what? Let's rotate a little bit more, right? And then on our next state, which we can create a toggle state for, so it goes back and forth as we tap on it. Collapsed. I'm going to grab the plus button to start. Rotate this back. And then I want to grab these icons and move them inwards like this. Now, of course, we're going to want to make sure that they are behind, and we'll get to that in a moment, but I'm also going to move this so that we can hide those text layers. Just like that. And we're going to want to make sure in our default state that the button is on top. There we go, much better. Now, of course, in the collapse state, we also don't want the overlay to be seen. So we're going to just take the opacity all the way down to 0. All right, so we have our default state and our collapse state looking pretty good. Now, of course, we can see the additional component behind. So let's delete this. And then inside the navigation bar, switch over to our collapse state. And what this will allow us to do is launch the preview. And now we can actually interact with it immediately because we created that toggle state. So if I press the plus button at the bottom, there we go. We have our floating action button, which is looking pretty good. Now, of course, from here, we can continue this process and create an additional nested component with, screens or overlays that trigger the send, receive, and trade options. You can have separate artboards that you can link to, all sorts of different things. But I think for now, we are going to leave things as this, but I think that looks kind of fun. If we wanted to get really fancy with this, let me edit this main component again. Just because, one thing we can do is we can also, edit these icons a little bit. Maybe push these in a touch, just so we have a little bit of animation across the different states. It may not be necessary, but sometimes if you're getting a little bit fancy, maybe. And then this one, we might want to bring this in, bring this in. Maybe move this up. And then finally, send. We're gonna do basically the same thing. Again, a lot of this might not be necessary, it might be overkill, but could be fun, right? Let's see how this looks. Yeah, it's there if you're really looking for it, but the majority of people are not going to see those animations. So they may be completely unnecessary. Now, the plus converting into a close icon, that may be completely necessary, right? But the other animations, honestly, probably not. All right, those shadows don't look like, yeah, so Drew, that's a good point. So on these guys here, because there are 3 shadows or 4 shadows stacked on top of each other, we have a little bit of a weird issue going on. So what I would probably do is just drop the opacity of all of them. Let's try about 8 on all of them. Or you can just, turn down the opacity of the overall shape. Something like that and like that, right? And you probably want to do it on the default state as well, which I did not do. There we go. That's a bit better. Alexander says, need to be snappier. So speaking of snappy, Alexander, that's a good point. What we can do is we can hop into prototype mode and we can actually, change this over to snap. Right now it's set to ease out, which is the default easing option for hover and toggle states, but we can change this over to snap and see what that looks like. Ah, that could work. Nice and snappy. Good call. All right, so someone's asking, can you give us the file, the work file? Possibly. So actually, now that you mention it, this is part of the UI kit that I'm working on that will be distributed, hopefully this month or next month at the latest. So you will have access to this file at some point in hopefully the near future. So yes, at some point you will be able to, poke around and experiment and figure out how things work if you don't want to, watch the entire stream one more time. All right, so that's looking pretty good. I'm pretty happy with the navigation bar. I think we are going to leave that as is. And in the last, 10 minutes or so, what we can do is we can start working on some of the other screens. So, one of the screens that we definitely want to cover at some point is our contacts. So if I go ahead and duplicate this screen, I can either duplicate it or I can create an entirely new screen, completely up to you, just like that. I can start, adding in our background. I can select our header at the top here, which is right here. Change this to contacts. I am going to keep the icons at the top the same. So we have our messages and we have our add button, which will allow you to add a contact. But down below, we might want to start adding in some functionality like search, for example. You know, you're on a contact screen, you might have someone in particular you want to find. You might want to search for that particular person. So I'm going to first copy the guides on this artboard. I'm going to paste them. Boop, there we go. And we're going to start by adding a very simple search field like this. I'm going to switch this back over to Alvarado. And we'll do something like maybe 18, and we'll keep it at regular. Maybe we'll do about 40. And I'm just going to do a simple line going across. Now, if you've been following the progress of this kit, you may have realized that, you know, we've been using these fancy broken lines for no particular reason other than they look kind of fun and they give the experience a little bit of style. So I can actually paste the appearance of that line right over here. So we kind of continue that look. Now, because we don't want the search bar to stand out too much, I might, you know, drop the size to maybe 1 and then drop the color a little bit as well. Just so it's nice and subtle. There we go. And then below this, we may want maybe recents. So this would be recent people that we speak to or, you know, send money to or whatever it might be on, or the last few people that we've sent to. A lot of different ways we can go about this, right? Draw one out. We'll round up the corners a little bit. Or if we want to continue that squircle or super ellipse feel, what we can do is actually use an ellipse and then hop into our plugins, go to our super ellipse plugin, and then transform. There we go. So this will be our name of the person, which we will fill out shortly. Let's bump this up to about semi-bold. And then we can use a repeat grid to create a few more. We can do 4, we can do 5. Completely up to you. I think 5 looks pretty good. That could do. It might be a little bit too many, but I think we're going to run with that for now. And then below, what we might want is all of our contacts. And, you know, in many contact applications and experiences, there are ways to filter your contacts. So we might want to do something like, I can copy this, all contacts over here. And then we may want maybe friends, family, and then possibly coworkers. And I'm going to make sure they are aligned really nicely. Now, here's another area where you might have active and inactive states. So you have to start thinking about how those are going to be displayed. Now, in this case, what I might do is just drop the opacity of the inactive and then, you know, follow the same pattern we've been using with our broken lines. So we might do something, you know, a solid line like this and maybe drop this to about, drop the dash to about 35. Maybe a little bit lower so we have a little bit of a bump on that side. There we go. That could do. Drew was saying those lines are super cool, but I have a feeling they're the stuff of developer nightmares. It's a good point, Drew. I mean, it shouldn't be too difficult, but definitely something you want to talk to your developers about to see if that's something that they can easily pull off or they just don't want to deal with it. That's why conversations with developers are very important. All right, let's see if I can squeeze through this very quickly. Basically, we have our friend name here, and then maybe underneath, maybe using a similar style to this, we might want to indicate what group they are in. So friends, family, so on and so forth. So we might want to do a little bit of a rectangle, maybe not as rounded. maybe 4, and then something like friend, right? Something like that. I'm gonna maybe drop the size just a little bit. And for something like this is probably a perfect opportunity to use groups and padding and stacks and all that fun stuff. So I'm gonna turn padding on. I'm gonna drop this a little bit. Drop this maybe to about 12. That way, if I do, for the next one, if I do, let's say, coworkers, I can very easily make changes to that. But this looks pretty good. We're gonna keep it at friend name, and, ooh, that's way too big. I will definitely have to fix that. But that is going to wrap things up for me for today. Kyle T. Webster is coming up in just a few moments. Definitely stick around for that. Big thank you to everyone who has tuned in. I'm going to continue cranking away at this UI kit so I can release it to all of you in hopefully the near future. Next week, we're going to be tackling a brand new project. If you have suggestions, definitely let me know on Twitter. And until next time, I'll see you all then.